so much time reading these. Yeah, raise your hands. Let's just have kind of an open free-for-all here. It would be good to have these questions. I like to get them in writing just for future reflection.
Get the cards bottom right now.
Yeah. Why don't you scan there? Okay, question?
Recent book, Beyond Culture Wars, Robert Horton, Christians United for Reformation, page 219 220. He states that anyone who denies that the grace of salvation is imparted by the sacraments are outside the realm of what we would refer to as evangelicalism. How common is this among Reformed theologians? Is it becoming more common?
In my reading, maybe it's Bob or others. Okay. The question is, how common is it among Reformed theologians that the grace of assurance is imparted through the sacraments? And you do find that. It's in Robert Dabney's Systematic Theology. You'll find it alluded to in Hodge. However, it is not prominent. And although just last week I was reading some old Puritan divines, and they were really camped on this. But for example, if you go to Burkhoff's, the Basis of Assurance, this little volume, which I think by and large is a very encouraging book, he even alludes to it, but it's a very small portion. So I think it's just like everything else, there is a continuum within the Reformed faith of those who stress those kind of external merits. That essentially was a Catholic idea, that the only way you could know that you were saved was through the participation in the church, and that stemmed from Augustine. That was his counsel. The best way to know that you were saved, because Augustine himself didn't have a clear doctrine of assurance. In fact, basically, he didn't, if I understand him correctly, he didn't really have a doctrine of assurance as we'd understand it at all. And so he said the best we can do, given that situation, is simply to be active in the church and participate in our sacraments. And that's the best evidence that you are, in fact, saved.
What part does the Old Testament play in the shaping, if any, of the Reformed view of assurance? And perhaps you may be commenting on this in a future lesson, but in what sense did Old Testament saints have assurance of salvation?
The question is, I'm not sure I can answer. What role did the Old Testament have to play in the development of the Reformed doctrine of assurance? And did the Old Testament saints have assurance? In the text that I've read, where that usually comes out is in the material that Zane will be getting into in the next hour, where they would argue from the doubts that Old Testament saints had about God's work in their life, or even perhaps God's hand or saving grace being upon them, as proof that faith and assurance are separate. So, to that extent, I know that they have used those Old Testament examples to prove the distinction between faith and assurance. That assurance is not part of the essence of saving faith. But beyond that, I'm not sure that I recall appeals to Old Testament works type thing. I just thought you're getting that as a proof of consciousness of assurance. Somebody has some input on that. Okay, this lack of assurance by great men of God like Dabney and Jonathan Edwards have assurance, troubles me. Does it you? Yes. What are we to say about these men? How can they be so fuzzy about so fundamental a doctrine? Well, I don't know what to say other than what I've already pointed out here, if in your frame of reference, if your paradigm involves works as somehow fundamentally necessary for salvation, or excuse me, as an evidence of salvation, indeed a life of works as necessary verification, or necessary to verify the presence of saving faith, then it's inevitable that your emotional shift and focus is going to be wrapped up in whether or not you have works of sufficient multiplicity and magnitude to satisfy the claims of conscience. That just comes with the paradigm. And that's why, I don't know how else to say it, that many of these great brothers and sisters in the faith were troubled with this. In my book, I gave an illustration of a brilliant Jewish scholar, they called him Rabbi Duncan. He was the guy that led Alfred Edersheim to Christ. He spoke, Sanskrit and Hebrew and Coptic and about 18 languages. And when they tried to interview him for a position of chair of Semitic languages at Cambridge, there was no one there that could test it. Dear brother, and he labored to the end of his life, struggling with the doctrine of assurance. And he went to Caesar Milan, who was a well-known spiritual counselor, and Caesar said, look, you got to use the practical syllogism. Major premise. If you're born again, you've got works. Minor premise. I've got works. Conclusion, I must be saved. And Rabbi Duncan kept focusing on that minor premise, and he said he ended his life in despair. He left a note just before he died saying, I can't put a plus on my regeneration. He said that there's been some good, there's some been bad. One day he broke down sobbing in front of his students in a theology class because he was in despair as to whether or not he was born again. It just comes with that kind of a system.
Do you, as a follow-up to that, though, do you feel that there is some disingenuous holiness, humility in the sort that some of these people claim that they're not sure of their salvation because they feel like it confirms that they're really holy because they're still in this self-examination? Do you think there's something that's disingenuous?
Well, as soon as you make a comment on that, you're getting into judging a person's motives, and you don't know what's going on in his heart. I personally have never met people that I felt were disingenuous. I felt they were sincere. I felt that they were trying to figure this out, and they wanted to know God, and they loved God, and they were just trying to, do it the way they knew how.
Jody, since you've been back in the States, have you seen the grace position making an advance within evangelical circles, or has the Reformed position won out? Do you see there any kind of movement in the tide of this battle, and what are your observations coming back in the States?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm qualified. The question is, do you see any advance made in the grace view? Or is the Reformed view becoming more and more prominent? I'm really not sure I'm qualified to judge that. From my own sphere of observation, it seems to me that both are becoming more and more prominent. And thanks largely to initiatives through Grace Evangelical Society and some of Zane's writings and Earl speaking around the country, there's a growing awareness of the issue and of the grace position. So it's very evident to me, coming back, that the grace viewpoint is really getting out there. And we owe an enormous debt to Zane, who, as far as I know, was the first one to ever work this through and carry it out consistently. Because when I was in seminary, I had bits and pieces that came out confused. And I think it's the overall consistency of it that's beginning to hang together for people, and so that it's getting more and more notice and credibility. But of course, Sproul was, he's big time.